Welcome, David Wiss here, registered dietitian, founder of Nutrition and Recovery. Today we're going to talk about food addiction. The language itself is enough to cause controversy. Some people think it should be called processed food addiction, while others believe it should be called an eating addiction. But either way, we cannot deny that food addiction has blown up in the scientific literature in the last 10 years. American Society of Addiction Medicine does recognize food as having addictive potential, and what we're talking about today is not food in its natural state, but highly concentrated byproducts of food. If you look at drugs of abuse, we see coca leaf in nature is not very addictive. It's fibrous, but we remove the fibers and get the concentrates, and then we process it further to make things like crack. Poppy plant turns into opium, which we process into heroin. Wheat plant turns into wheat flour, which turns into white flour. If you get the gist, the concentration matters. Sugar cane to raw sugar to refined sugar, corn to corn syrup to high fructose corn syrup. So the concentration and the dose is what activates a lot of the dopamine pathways in the brain. Dopamine teaches us not only what feels good, but how to remember and repeat the behaviors. It's not just a dopamine system, but there's the opioid system and this gut-brain axis, which is our communication network, all of which regulate eating behavior. We do have evidence in animal models of addiction transfer from mother to offspring based on what's consumed during pregnancy. The Yale Food Addiction Scale has been used to document this abnormal desire for sweet, salty, and fatty foods. Some evidence has shown that food addiction occurs in about half of obese patients with binge eating disorder. Binge eating disorder and food addiction are not the same thing. They do often co-occur, but they can exist independently. It's important to acknowledge that binge eating disorder is a recognized clinical diagnosis, whereas food addiction currently is not. One study recently showed that food addiction is actually a larger problem than binge eating disorder. So the debate isn't about whether or not it exists, but the debate is about what do we do about it. If it's true that people have a food addiction, should they become abstinent from their addictive foods? Or does becoming abstinent just lead to more disordered eating patterns such as binging, etc.? Some people do say that becoming abstinent from their addictive foods was the key to their freedom. Currently, eating disorder professionals in general are somewhat uneasy about incorporating this data because classic eating disorders like anorexia typically don't resemble an addiction, and educating people about food addiction can reinforce people's extreme and disordered thought processes around food. Food addiction does challenge the dogmatic messages of it's not about the food, or there are no bad foods, or just eat everything in moderation. Food addiction is saying that it is about the food, right? We have to look at the biology. A calorie is not a calorie. It's complex information that's sent to the gut, to the brain, and to the endocrine system. The controversy around food addiction and how to incorporate that into eating disorder algorithms was described in a paper we wrote last year. When looking at an addiction epidemic, there are important things to consider. Things like availability, affordability, and these are all important things to look at with the food supply. I always learn to follow the money. With nutrition, I follow the money. The dilemma is that without a lot of money, you don't have a lot of data, which doesn't translate to a lot of science. So a lot of the funding comes from Big Food, and Big Food has an agenda to promote their bottom line. You see detractors of the food addiction hypothesis, and if you track their funding sources, you often find that it comes back to food companies. This one review states that the science doesn't support a food addiction model, but then you look to see the funding source, and of course it's coming from Big Food. The paper stated things like, findings are misinterpreted, like certain foods are addictive. They even went on to say that using this addiction model could lead to further food-related pathology. But the evidence shows something different, right? People that believe in food addiction are actually less stigmatizing and blaming of other people. Another study showed that believing in food addiction was associated with positive policies to intervene on a public health level. If we accept food addiction, we can start to use better targeted research. We can get people better treatment. We can consider how do we change the food environment. Legal interventions like advertising restrictions, taxes, litigation, targeted educational programs. These will all be important for the future of our nation. Food addiction doesn't require abstinence, but it does require reducing exposure in most cases. It most importantly requires recovery. Brains can be rewired, but it takes many years. We need to start looking more at the composition of the food we eat, particularly looking at nutritional quality over just quantity. Quantity is just calories. We need to go much, much further. The food industry continues to deny any responsibility. They fund research which exonerates themselves. They point back to individual responsibility, pointing to exercise, use the same generic messaging, influence government policy, and continue to control the public discourse around nutrition. We need to start demanding truth, seeking truth, and spreading truth. My food philosophy is that all foods fit, but not all foods fit for all people, and just because the food industry manufactures it and sells it does not mean we have to include it. If you have questions or comments, please leave them below.